Um, Hello, all. Welcome to the book discussion hosted by the Journal of Review of Democracy. I am Anubha Anushree, editor at the Review of Democracy, and I would be your host today, and we would be discussing Margrit Pernau's latest book, Jamia's Aapa, The Many Life Worlds of Gerda Philipsborn, published by Speaking Tiger in 2024. Margaret, here is my book. Before we begin the discussion, I'd like to thank the CEU team and my dear assistant editors for their help in putting this panel together. We are live streaming on YouTube, and we encourage you to use the comment section to share your thoughts or questions throughout the event. And we'll try our best to include your questions, comments at the end of our discussion. Along with having Margaret on the show, we are also joined by two distinguished historians of South Asia, Professor Janaki Nair and Professor David Lelyveld. Before I introduce the speakers, a little bit of housekeeping first. We will begin with brief comments from Janaki and David on the book, which will be followed by Margaret's response to their comments. We will then open the discussion to further questions or comments from our viewers. So let me begin with introducing our stellar panelists. Our speakers are known to many of us for their long and deep engagement with South Asia. In today's language, they have been trendsetters or influencers in their fields, and so it makes my job incredibly difficult. These introductions, therefore, are merely indicative and not exhaustive. Our first speaker on the panel is Professor Janaki Nair. Janaki is a distinguished historian of modern India and a former professor of Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Her work spans urban history, labor and legal histories, feminism, and the cultural politics of southern India. She's the author of several influential books, including Women and Law in Colonial India, first published in 1996, followed by the excellent monograph, Miners and Mill Hands, that I'm currently using to write an article on disability, the history of disability in India. But above all, Janaki has contributed significantly through her incisive historical examination of Mysore through her 2011 work, Mysore Modern. And most recently, The Promise of the Metropolis, Bangalore's 20th Century, published by Oxford University Press in 2025. Janaki has also published numerous scholarly essays and public writings and has shaped key debates on gender, class, and urban modernity in South Asia. It is wonderful to have you with us, Janaki. She's joining us from Mysore. Bangalore, is it Janaki or Mysore?
Bangalore.
Okay, great. Wonderful to have you here. Our second speaker is Professor David Lelyveld, whose works have deeply shaped the study of modern South Asia, especially the fields of colonial education, Muslim intellectual life, and cultural history. Amongst David's many works, his landmark book, first published in 1978, Aligarh's First Generation, Muslim Solidarity in British India, is a foundational study of Aligarh movement and the emergent Muslim modernity. David has also authored influential essays and the social and political history of Urdu and its differentiation from Hindi. He has held faculty and administrative positions at the University of Minnesota, Columbia, and Cornell. He retired as professor of history at William Paterson University in New Jersey. Very honored to have you with us today. Our final speaker and the author of the book under discussion today is Margrit Pernau, who is the professor at the Freie University, Berlin, and a senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, Berlin. She's a leading historian of modern South Asia, and her scholarship bridges the history of emotions, Urdu literary culture, and conceptual history. She is the author and co-author of several books, including the influential work, Ashraf into Middle Classes, Muslims in 19th Century Delhi, Emotions and Modernity in Colonial India, which was first published in English language by Oxford University Press in 2013. She's also published widely in academic journals on translation, temporality, and the semantic histories of concepts in India. And most recently, her article entitled Decolonizing Theory and Concepts in the journal History and Theory that I have been perusing for my own research too. So great to have you with us here today, Margaret. With this brief introduction, let me first turn to Janaki for your remarks on Margaret's book. So over to you, Janaki.
Thank you very much for having me here. I was delighted to be invited to an event like this. And of course, Margaret, congratulations for a wonderful book that I have learned much from, since I really did not know much either about the particular figure you've discussed, nor about the milieu to which she belonged in the later part of her life. But in the interest of time, I've just made a few notes that I thought can be used to spark off a discussion. And so instead of trying to summarize the book or to go through the book in some fashion which actually resembles a written book review, I thought I would raise a few questions that the biography of Gerda Philipsborn raised for me, and possible ways of thinking about the history of emotions in relation to the idea of a biography. So first of all, let me start by saying this is an extremely readable biography, with very interesting cross-country comparisons in terms of the worlds that Gerda came from and the worlds that she chose to join, particularly in India and specifically in Jamia, and the worlds that she chose to fashion for herself. Now, I think one of the interesting parts of the book for me was the, relatively unknown to me at least, exchanges between Germany and India, which go beyond actually the friendship around which much of this biography is actually structured, the friendship between Gerda and Zakir Hussain, Abid Hussain, and Mujib, as well as a more antagonistic relationship, perhaps, to the figure of Mudoli. In these exchanges, one learns, of course, of India's presence in an international frame, international exhibitions, for example, almost presaging the first Festival of India. But I think what this book also does, and I don't know if this was intended, is that it serves as a biography of the institution itself. And for me, that was a big learning, taking away the idea that the biography of this relatively unknown person, to me at least, also shed enormous light on the contributions of a place like Jamia to the intellectual life of colonial India, but also to post-independence India. So thank you for both those very fine contributions that the book makes to our understanding of intellectual history in India, on which actually not much has. We don't have too many institutional biographies. Um, and let me get straight to the question that has led Margaret, I believe, to describe her figure, the central figure of her book, as a ghost whom she has tried to capture on the basis of very slender traces that this person has left in the archive. And those of us who are feminists know that it is extremely difficult to find sources for talking about not just women's presence, but also women as sign in the history of particularly a country like India, which has such a strong oral tradition, and the chances of people leaving written sources or traces of their lives and existence um, is much smaller. Having said that, I'll come back to the question of biography a little later, but just let me just dwell here on the problem of sources that has been foregrounded so early in this book. The problem of sources relating to Gerda Philipsborn to start with, and therefore a reliance, an imaginative and speculative reliance on the work of her friends and, of course, on her times. And I'm going to come to this times question also in just a minute. So, in many places, there is this reminder that we are dealing with a figure who has left not much of an archival trace. There is very imaginative use here, I should mention, also of photographs, which are not only illustrative of her life, but also of the age and the place about which so much of the individual is learned. So I like this frank admission of the limitation of sources throughout. And I like the way in which that limitation has been compensated in what I see are two ways. One is through building up a milieu through comparison of sameness. So there are, and I'm not going to cite the page numbers here in the interest of time again, but there are many pages on which the historical parallel of, something that is similar to Gerda's experience and life is also similar to other figures, both in the German and in the Indian setting. But there is also a frequent invocation, and this I think is actually quite novel, of difference. So there is a way in which difference is emphasized in order to again provide this kind of context in which a figure like this is being discussed. So both are invoked, both difference and sameness appear to be invoked as a way of compensating for the relative smallness of the archival trace that we have of somebody like Gerda, despite her immense contribution to the institution itself, institution building, and so on and so forth. So the journey is actually enlivened by the fact that there is this attempt to invoke both sameness and difference. But this book actually led me to think a great deal about the historical method. And the rest of the comments that I'm going to make are actually confined to the question of method, because the history of emotions has been deployed here in a very interesting way, overlaid, if you like, on this individual biography and what I also read as an institutional biography. This is a So it led me to think about all kinds of other works and other methodologies that have actually looked at questions of emotion, though in very, very different ways. And I thought it might be useful to recount some of these earlier ways in which questions of emotion have been invoked in masterly ways, actually, to write history. I'm thinking of particularly to start with, the work of people who have looked at emotions as prompting crowd or collective actions. The Great Fear by Lefebvre, The Great Shiver by Indivar Kamtekar on the 1942 and the kinds of effects that it had in India when the Japanese were at the door, so to speak, where there is an attempt by the historians not to look for agency so much as tenuous and very hard to read, kinds of signs of how collective action is actually prompted by a common kind of emotion. As I said, in both cases, we are talking really about fear, but they have both been used to very great effect and have established the history of emotions as a very important uh, avenue to establishing or to discussing certain kinds of historical inquiries, especially, as I said, on the actions of crowds, on mobs, and of collective actions more generally. The other thought that came to me when I was reading this book was the very early work of Raymond Williams, who, as we all know, was a materialist to the core, a Marxist, in fact. His 1954 work, in which he described famously this phrase, structure of feeling. Now, this phrase, structure of feeling, has two elements, as you can see. One is structure, one is feeling. Uh, When was this replaced by what Margrit Pernau foregrounds as the history of emotions? I was trying to track that myself. It's not a field in which I'm any expert, so it was new to me too. But in any case, I'm curious about this trajectory because what Raymond Williams pioneered was a way of thinking about uh, certain kinds of feelings which attain a kind of social acceptability at specific conjunctures where the structure actually enables, I mean, the structure is less easily transformed, as we know. So it is the feeling that enters into and becomes part of a common sense. And I think he made a very, very important contribution to understanding, the ways in which societies in transition are actually, making certain kinds of feelings socially acceptable. And he is probably the first to actually recognize, given that he comes from this very strong Marxist and materialist background, that there is something to say, to prove, or not to prove so much, but to suggest that feelings are fundamentally social, but it is sometimes, as he has so brilliantly shown in other writing, a social that has not yet emerged. So we do have that legacy, if you like. Um, and I want to draw our attention here in the last few minutes that I'm going to take to discuss another very powerful strand of the history of emotions that has emerged in the Indian context. And that is in actually largely in Dalit autobiographies. So, I'm going to come back, Margaret, to the suggestion you seem to have made of perhaps the biography being a slightly outdated mode of writing history, but I'll come back to that in just a second to say that the Dalit the Dalit autobiographies in particular have enabled us to understand certain emotions that have been experienced by these people who were denied, as you all know, access to and representation in state sources, archival sources, and so on and so forth, and yet have been so well able to describe the experience of humiliation in particular. That has been a very powerful strand of Dalit autobiographical writing. And this experience of humiliation, here again, individually experienced, but in fact is a collective experience. And it is that interface between the individual and the collective that is of interest to me here, and which is, as you know, central to Dalit memory. So there are excellent collections of Dalit autobiographies. The two most recent ones I want to cite here are, of course, the ones that focus on Southern Indian autobiographical writing, edited by Satyanarayana and Suji Taru. Two volumes, one on Kannada and Tamil, and the Telugu, and the other on Tamil and Malayalam. And I strongly urge those of you who are interested in that to go and read these. But there is, as I said, the history of emotions here put to use in a completely different kind of way. So we're talking about, once more, an absence of sources, and a way in which the absence of sources and a peoples without history, such as the Dalits of India, have been actually able to, what Mahadev Shankanapura, one of the Kannada poets, writers, has described as imaginative truths, that they have to be able to imagine their history differently from the kinds of people who might have had the place in society that is going to provide and establish certain kinds of sources that have remained with us for, as a source for us to be able to construct those pasts. And I'm almost at the end of what I want to say, but I want to come back to this question of biographies. I actually disagree that the biography has, in some ways, faded as a form of history writing. If anything, I would say it has actually seen a revival. There is an entire series being edited by Dilip Menon it's the Pathfinder series, I believe, of biographies, which are basically of relatively well known, but also some relatively unknown people. And you have the brilliant biography of people like the biologist Janaki Nair, which has more recently been written. The New India Foundation Award book prize this year has been won by Aparajit Ramnath, who's written on Vishwesharaya. There is any number of biographies that are somehow, seeing the light. I think people enjoy actually reading the lives of individual people, and this has been in some ways encashed by a large number of people in very serious ways through historical writing. So it's not at all something that is appearing to be disappearing it looks to be disappearing as a form of historical writing at all. And I think that is also to be welcomed. So, in conclusion, I would say that what has been attempted here is, of course, a biography seen through the lens of emotion. And one of the pioneering methodological moves that has been made here is the context setting that compares Gerda's experiences to other, German people whom she may never have herself encountered, but whose lives are quite similar to the kinds of experiences that she had. And that continues as well into the Indian setting, where there is, of course, there are four very robust and very visible male figures against whom she is battling to be recognized as a historical figure herself. So, thank you for this book, which raises so many interesting questions, not only about institutional history and individual biography, but as I've mentioned, I hope through the examples I've given, also takes us back to the legacies of the history of emotion, and perhaps allows us to ask a few questions about what has changed and why the history of emotions has today become as important as it has. Thank you very much.
Great. So, David, can you please mute your audio? It's interfering with reception.
Is this okay? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but let me quickly transition to you. And if can you give me a couple of minutes to just quickly transition to you? And you can mute your audio in the meantime.
Okay.
Janki, that's fine. You can turn off your video. Yeah. So thank you, Janki. That was an excellent overview of the book. And as you were talking about biographies, I was thinking also recent works on Savitri Bai Phule and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, both of which have received wide reception in South Asian scholarship. And indeed, as you were talking about emotions as a source of collective political action, which has been widely ignored in both history and political science. I was also thinking how Margaret's work shows that it's not just negative emotions, but also positive ones of friendship and care that compel specific historical change. So thank you again, Janki, for alerting us to this aspect of Margaret's book. And before we turn to Margaret for her response, we would like to hear from David. So David, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Janaki, for your remarks, although I have to say the audio was not very clear. And thanks, Anubha, for putting this together under very difficult circumstances. But finally, we're here to discuss this very rich and interesting book that Margaret has written. I first met Margaret almost 25 years ago, in of all places, at the Jamia. A conference put together by our friend, the late Mushir Al Hassan, called Living Together Separately. And she had just written her book on Hyderabad and was dissatisfied with it, as she told me. But she gave me a copy of it, and it was a very workmanlike and enterprising book, but she sort of put it aside and went through a long uh, apprenticeship, we might say, of immersing herself in Delhi culture and putting out the translation of Ahmad Navisi and ultimate the collection on Delhi College, and ultimately Ashraf into middle classes. And then she, I think, discovered. She put Weber aside, Max Weber aside, and discovered different approaches to history. And she made me aware also of Koselleck and multiple time frames and multiple chronologies. But most of all, of course, the history of concepts and the history of emotions. And as I was reading this very imaginative organization of the book around emotions, I also was thinking of what I had read before I started my Oliger work, which was by another German Jew with the unlikely name of Erik Erikson, who was a psychoanalyst who worked with children. And actually, I think reading Erikson alongside this book adds a whole interesting dimension because it talks about stages of growth and childhood and puts them in historical frameworks. And we could talk a lot about that. What's interesting about this book, it's not a biography, and that's fine. It's because of the lack of information, but maybe also because of the difficulty of putting together a whole life uh, and knowing the inner life. You know, there's a share by Mirza Ghalib, which is not in the Divan, but is often quoted, Koi aga nahi batani hum degar se. कोई आगा नहीं बात नहीं हम देगर से है हर फर जहां को फलक ना, which means we can never know the inner life of another person. Every person in the world is an unread book. Or as my teacher Naim, the late CM Naim, said, a book with the pages uncut. Um, the so it's very difficult to put together a whole life, and maybe that's okay. That one can talk in episodes, but in some ways, what Margrit does is construct a life using Gerda's life as a kind of through line, as they say, or as a resultant of multiple sources and so on. And that requires her to tell many different histories. In the Ashraf into Middle Classes, she talked about entangled history, but there wasn't that much entanglement in the book. There's lots of it here, entangling different histories, moving in a kind of counterpoint to each other. And one thing is the history of early 20th century Germany, particularly Berlin, but also other places, Kiel and Munich appear importantly in the book. We go through 220 pages of the book, something like that, before we get to Jamia and India. And this is such a rich history that much has been written about, but to see it as it coming together in the life not only of Gerda Philipsborn, but also of the Indian Muslims who came to Berlin to study. Zakir Saab, Mujib Saab, Abid Hussain Saab, in particular. There was this whole milieu that she mixed with in this multiple cosmopolitan world. And I would say there's something personal in Margrit's quest here, because she has moved in multiple cosmopolitan worlds as well. And I know I can see why she was drawn to this book. And she says a little bit about that, but probably could say a lot more about why the project of searching out for Gerda's life appealed to her. And then there's when you talk about the early history of Germany, there's always looming the coming of the Nazis, the Holocaust, and all the horrible things that happened. And you don't have to spell it out, but it's there. And similarly, when we talk about early 20th century India, the partition is there, and one moves toward those narratives in some interesting way. The history of German Jews is an important part of this story. There's a book which is not, Margrit doesn't use, by an Israeli writer, Amos Alon, on the history of German Jews, which talks about this breakthrough in, it was a very small population. I think less than 2% of the German population. It wasn't like Poland or Eastern Europe, where there were much larger numbers of Jews. But there was a breakthrough in the late 18th century, Moses Mendelssohn in particular, which is called the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. And this led to this whole movement of Jews who either they abandoned their religion, they often converted to Christianity, as a matter of fact. We have people like Karl Marx, who was a grandson of two rabbis and such. And they moved radically over and were transformative, not only in their own milieu, a fairly small milieu, very often quite prosperous, but also in the world Jewish community. So, for example, my grandparents, who were Polish Jews, had a picture of Goethe in their hanging on their wall. It was this was part of being a cultured person, and all of that, this striving to be separate, to use Moshe Hassan's words, living together separately was the challenge. And many people have written about it, and it's very interesting to see that alongside the history of Muslims. And Margrit mentions that, where Muslims, particularly in India, had to deal with themselves as a minority. This is a unique and almost unique in Islamic history until recent times. And that's what Zakir Hussain and Muhammad Mujib and Abid Hussain dealt with. And one could say much more about them, but we can see these two worlds coming together in Margrit's book. As Margrit speaks about the lack of sources, that one has to deal with ghosts, and it occurred to me that what one can't quite do here, and one really can't do very often in a biography in general, is what writers do, novelists. That one could imagine a novel and just letting go and getting into an imagined space of someone like Gerda's head, or someone like Zakir Sab's head, and with streams of consciousness and dialogue and all of those things that novelists can get away with, and we conscientious historians who rely on documentation have to do without. And in some sense, that would be more revealing, although it's dangerous and it could be misleading in many ways. But I think that's the next step for someone. I don't know if Margaret is inclined to writing a novel or a play, but it seems to me that this is material that would lend itself to one thing I'm reading, when you have, some of you know, is by Natalie Davis and Leo Africanus. This, what is it, 16th century, 15th, 16th century Muslim from Granada, who was captured by pirates and brought to the Vatican and made to supposedly become a Christian, but then would return to Africa. And that book is entirely constructed on hypotheticals, in some way, like Margaret's book. And then I compare it to a novel by Amin Malouf, about Leo Africanus, in which he just makes it up as he goes along, and you can read them side by side in that same way. So that's an interesting literary project that somebody may be inspired to do with this book, and I think it would be worth imagining ourselves into it. Finally, I want to say something about the history of education. Which and specifically the history of the education of young children. That's what Gerda did at the Jamia kindergarten, and she had her experience with that in the eastern section of. I can't remember the name of that neighborhood, but of Berlin, when she worked with mostly migrants from Jewish migrants from Eastern Europe. She was exposed to there's a burgeoning period of interest in the education of young children. And we have that in Rudolf Steiner, in Maria Montessori, in the music of Karl Orff for children, and things of that sort. And she was a participant in that. And actually, there's sadly very little of that in India. There has been some good scholarship about it, but the history of elementary education, I have to say I neglected it entirely in my Oliger book, although that was an important part of the Oliger story. And the imaginative use of education, which we have some notion. It's maybe Shanti Niketan, maybe what is it, the Krishnamurti schools in India. But that's also something that I'd love to see more about, and maybe Margaret will do more of that in her forthcoming work on the Jamia. So thank you for the book, and I think that's probably enough for me.
Thank you, David, for this rich comment. David, can I ask you to mute your device, your computer?
Yes.
Thank you. So as you were talking, David, I was also thinking about the title, which uses the more expansive term life world, which I think describes something closer to what you began your remarks with. I was also thinking about the genre of speculative history that has emerged as defining the histories of Indian Ocean, as well as slavery and indentured labor. So again, thank you for your rich comments, David, and for alerting us to the various transitions that shaped Gerda's world. And thank you again to both the commentators for their deep engagement with the book. I would also quickly like to remind our viewers to use the comment section to share their thoughts, their comments, their questions for any of our panelists. Now I would like to turn to the author of the book, Margrit, to please respond to David's and Janaki's comments on the book, as well as share your thoughts on the writing of the social and intimate history of Jamia's Aapa.
Thank you so much. It's really an author's dream come through to have such thoughtful engagement with the book and to have readers like the two of you. So I could respond for an hour. I'm picking and choosing to keep within the 15 minutes. Starting with Janaki, the exchanges and the cosmopolitanism of Germany. I think that is one of the questions I've really been struggling with, because on the one hand, there is this cosmopolitanism in Berlin at that time, and it makes complete sense that the three young boys who identified themselves as nationalists and sort of leftists engaged with the cosmopolitan part of Berlin. The only problem is they didn't do it. So the people they engaged with most, and both the guy they lived with, Wilhelm Schwaner, and also the PhD supervisors, both of Zakir Hussain and of Abid Hussein, were not cosmopolitan at all. They were right in the most right-wing fringe of the Völkisch, which later ended up with the Nazis. And I'm really still struggling to find a way to explain that, how it was not a problem for these three young students to engage with in a very loving relationship and a very admiring relationship with these right-wingers. And until the end of their life, they always said how big of an influence these people had on their ideas of education and on everything they did for Jamia. The only thing is, it's not true. If you look at the educational ideas that people like Eduard Spranger and Schwaner and some of their friends had, and you compare that to what was happening in Jamia once the three came back and took over the leadership in Jamia, it's completely different. And in the end, so for a long time, I was just struggling and saying, why are they saying that? And where do the ideas come from? Until I discovered that the real influence did not come from Germany, but it came through the training that the primary school teachers had in Moga in the Punjab, by Presbyterian missionaries who in turn had trained with John Dewey at Columbia. So it was within the same new education movement, which is a very broad category, which encompasses people from the extreme right to really into the left. And it was a movement also in Soviet Russia, etc. So it was a very broad movement, and the part of the movement which really influenced Jamia was John Dewey rather than the German people. Then I found it so interesting what you said about these different streams of the history of emotions coming together. I think I would take your interest in emotions as a collective experience together with what David quoted, this wonderful share by Ghalib, that you can never look into a person's head, because that alerts us to how different the concepts of emotions are in both of these cases. So Ghalib has an idea of the self where the emotions are somewhere inside the self, and they are hidden until the subject is willing to reveal them. If the subject is not willing to open the book, then there's no way that we can access them. What you say about the Dalit autobiographies, and also the way that I've been playing around with Gerda's emotion, not limiting it to herself, but to a group, goes into a different direction where the emotions are not inside of the self, but are floating between subjects and the surrounding atmosphere. Once you have this open concept of emotions, which was, irrespective of the fact that Ghalib did not subscribe to that, but which was quite prevalent in North India among the Muslims still in the 19th century, where you had people like Nazir Ahmed saying you always have to be very careful with whom you interact, because you're going to catch emotions like you catch the flu. So emotions not as something that is inside, but as something which floats around people and which is external to them and which is relational. And once you look at this relational concept of emotion, which these days is very much discussed in affect theory, it becomes much easier to get at collective emotions and to get at emotions where you don't have to break open the book in order to get them. So not the kind of Erikson model, but the model that you look at what is floating between people. What are they sharing? And that is easier to see from the outside. Then the question about Muslims as a minority and how far did the three students also have an interest in Gerda because they thought that as Muslims they were in a similar situation as the Jews were. One thing is that before partition, Jamia very consciously avoided talking about Muslims as a minority. So they saw themselves as co-creators of Hindustan, not as a minority which needed to be protected, which needed to have rights because they did not really belong. So for them, the belonging was absolutely out of question. They were not a minority. They were part of Hindustan. They used it in the image of Mother India. So they were equal sons of Mother India, not the minority. And I think it's also dangerous to say that they adapted to Gerda in a way, because at least until Gerda came to India, her way of living her Jewishness, unlike the generation of her parents, was very much tied up with Zionism. And parallel, as Faisal Devji has pointed out, the parallel between Jewish Zionism and the Muslims is the Pakistan movement. It's not Jamia. It's exactly what Jamia stood against. So we are not a minority. We don't want to salvage our community by moving out, which would be the Zionist project, but we want to stay where we are and we want to be part of the nation. So it changes after partition, obviously. So then even people like Mujib start talking about, and Azad start talking about minority, but you can feel this despair. Now we have to take this category of minority. It is a failure. It is what we never wanted Jamia to be. We never wanted Jamia to be a minority institution. We wanted it to be Millia and Islamia, national and Islamic at the same time, and in a way where the two categories don't subtract from each other, but reinforce each other. And then finally, very briefly, the ghost. I think the ghost is going to haunt me for some more time. What I like about the ghost is that it has a presence which cannot be pinned down. So it's really advocating taking the ghost serious. So the ghost is a being which floats through a room. You can't necessarily see it, but you can feel that the ghost is there. And you can, if you want to perceive the ghost, so at least my detective stories tell me, the way to do it is looking at them not directly, but through an angle. So either through a mirror or from the angle of your eye. And that is exactly what I tried to do with Gerda. So if there is no if I can't see her by looking directly at her, then perhaps I can see some of her traces by looking at other people. And they then reflect her. And you have these traces of a ghost who has just moved through a room, and you can still collect the traces without ever being able to nail the ghost down. I don't think that I have the capability of writing a novel. I wish I had, but I'm too much of a historian. So I think going for ghosts for me is the kind of compromise where I still try to remain anchored in historical facts. So I'm not writing anything where I absolutely don't have the sources. So I'm trying to make that clear. Even where I'm speculating on the basis of sources. But further than that, I think there are other people who can do that much better than I can. So thank you so very much, both of you, and also Anubha, for bringing us together. It was really a joy. And I'm looking forward to the comments, if there are any.
Yeah, so as you were talking, Margaret, I was also thinking about the term you have used in your work, which is cosmopolitanism of the heart. And it seems to me that it referenced a specific tradition of cosmopolitanism, which was not defined by national and racial identity, but rather described an affinity to shared concrete worlds, friendships and partnerships which were based on shared lived reality. And so it was a kind of cosmopolitanism that, as I was reading your work, I thought was very engaging to me. It was a cosmopolitanism which was not actively defined by its antagonism to national boundaries, and rather inhabited an eclectic space of ideas and physical comity. With that, I also wanted to congratulate you for bringing out the focus on primary education that David also sort of mentioned in his comments as a source of critical pedagogical practice in India. And primary education, as all of us know, has long been neglected by both historians as well as policymakers in the country. So congratulations on that. So thank you again for these responses. Let us move on to discussion now. Janaki and David, would you like to briefly respond to Margaret, or shall we move on to the questions from our viewers?
I think questions from viewers should have the first.
Right. Yes. Great. So do we have questions from the audience? Let me quickly take a look at the chat. So doesn't seem like we have many questions. I can begin with a question of mine that I thought I'd have, if I had the time, I'd probably pose it to Margaret. Is that fine, Margaret? Should we go ahead with my question first? Okay. So I thought one aspect of the book which I was quite struck by, and both David and Janaki have also commented on this aspect of your book, which is that this book also seems to me to be a simultaneous history of both Germany and India, Berlin and Delhi, that although we're very far apart physically, also have deep resonances in this book. As David said, we don't reach the story of Jamia until page 220. But also Berlin and Delhi were cities which were progressively marked by crisis. You talk in great detail about the humiliation of the First World War, the effects of that humiliation in the social life of Berlin, and the emergence of Weimar Republic in Germany. But also simultaneously in India, there is the emergence of anti-colonial and nationalist movements in the 1920s that unsettled the Indian social and political life. And so in what ways did these very different crises also push people like Gerda and Zakir, Abid Hussain and Muhammad Muzib to seek different ideas, peoples, and cultures? How did crisis in the interwar period also become a springboard for very different kinds of cultural and political ideas of education in Germany and India?
I think that would be part of the explanation that I would be trying to give to the question why they resonate so well with people like Spranger, etc. I'm working on an article together with my colleague Frederick Schröer on that topic. So what we came up with so far is that it is this shared experience of crisis and to some extent also the shared solution, the shared emotions and the shared solutions and practices they're developing, which establishes a resonance between this very improbable resonance between people like Spranger and like Abid Hussain or Muhammad Mujib. So they can identify to a certain extent. They didn't have the knowledge that we have today, of course, about Nazi Germany. But still, there is this tension. Why aren't they more critical about these right-wingers? And I think the common experience of crisis and the common emotions and the resonance that produces is what would be the direction in which we have to look for an answer.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I look like distracted because I'm trying to review the YouTube chat box for any questions. So there is a question from one of our assistant editors. Soumya asks, can we throw some light on the tension between formal archives and affective embodied ones, as Aapa Jaan's presence survives less through documents and more through embodied practices and memory? So a question probably on historical method, and I thought your work speaks volumes to, as Janaki's comments suggested, volumes to the kind of methods we employ to write histories.
I'm not sure that I'm really going for the embodied archives, because what is there in Jamia today is not marked by a memory of what Gerda lived, and perhaps not even by a memory of what the first generation in Jamia lived. So embodied archive, I would be a little bit hesitant. It depends what you mean by formal archive. So if the formal archive is the building of the archive, which you can enter and where you have all the documents well collected and organized, yes, that doesn't really exist for Jamia. But it is still an archive in a traditional sense, which I had to build up for the book project myself, but which is not less formal. I mean, I have the written documents from all kinds of sources. I have the visual sources. I have some audio records. So it is I'm not sure I would make a big distinction between a formal archive and the kind of more fluid archive I'm using, except for the fact that it is much more time consuming to put that together than just to walk into the British Library, go through the find books, and then within 2 hours you have the documents if there is no major IT crisis.
Yes, probably also a little more grants for that. I did have a question from another assistant editor, Anjali, and she asks you on the organization, the association Gerda formed. So she says, Gerda started an association called Payam-e-Biradari, where she encouraged correspondence between students across cities. This association was especially popular among young girls who would partake in debates on various social issues. We find that Payam had taken a particularly masculine tone following Gerda's absence and death. Did the Payam ever regain its original ethos at a later stage?
I'm not sure it would be the original one, because the Payam Talim was founded in 26,
Yeah.
and her influence started in 35, so it is not the original ethos. And I must admit, I have read the issues quite carefully until 47, but not much beyond. I'm not aware that they ever had a female editor in the years after independence. So I have to leave the question open. It did not recover from the male orientation before independence.
Sorry. Right. We have another question from Divyansh. You have discussed how cosmopolitanism, so we are back to the term cosmopolitanism, I guess. You've discussed how cosmopolitanism in university spaces is insufficient in that it implies mere coexistence, and highlighted the importance of fellowship instead. What steps can be taken at an institutional level to facilitate the same? Does the current geopolitical paradigm threaten campus spaces in this regard? This is also a very open-ended question.
I'm not a novelist, but I'm also not a prophet. I'm not a politician either. So I think really at the moment, any form of cosmopolitanism we had for the last couple of decades is crumbling before our eyes. And of course, we have to do whatever we can at whatever place we are to see how we can safeguard that. But I think it is very much, if it is a cosmopolitanism of the heart, it is very much also based on personal relationships, and to see that these personal relationships don't fall apart because of big politics. And as teachers, to cultivate relationships and to encourage our students and to teach our students to cultivate these relationships as far as we can. But I'm afraid that what the big politics can destroy in 5 minutes, which took us decades to build up, there is not so much cause for hope at the moment, which doesn't mean that we don't have to continue doing whatever we can.
Great. So Janaki and David, would you like to return to some of the themes that Margrit raised in her response to your comments?
Not really, but I do want to sort of respond to David's rather categorical dismissal of the book as a biography, and that, it is something else. To say that, I think what the book does is actually, of course, single out certain parts of her life and to a certain extent shine a light on particular aspects of the institutional life, which perhaps not so well known, especially related to primary education. But I don't think it can be discounted as a biography. In fact, if anything, it is hanging together as a biography more than anything else. And I wondered where that, how else one describes this as a genre of writing. I'm just curious because it seemed like you had an alternative frame for understanding this kind of work.
Well, that's a long discussion, but I was in the last year or two, I came under the influence of Siegfried Krakauer, the historian of cinema, who questioned the whole notion of writing long-term uh, uh, histories. You could say the history of India, and I'm just extrapolating from that to biography and the notion that we can only know little bits and pieces, and that actually the work of uh, writers and filmmakers and so on do that without. Otherwise, you get something like the Gandhi movie 40 years ago, which is just one long story. To really capture in a smaller place some moment of coming together. But that's a whole other discussion. I wanted to raise the connection between emotions and education. That could be said in some sense. A lot of these new education and even somewhat older education movements were devised to create a certain boundaries and categories of emotion, legitimate emotion and otherwise. And I'm thinking particularly of Durkheim's book on moral education, which very much resonated to me when I thought of what Syed Ahmed Khan said to the students in Oliver. This notion that one has to feel a kind of solidarity with the collective. And that, of course, in many of the educational movements, both left and right, were designed to create that kind of solidarity, for better or worse. Uh, but a lot of education was designed to create uh, uh, certain emotional channels, let's say, that students would have, and a certain conformity. I think maybe as Margaret works on the history of Jamia, that's a good thing to pull those two things together.
I'd
Right.
certainly focus on the history of emotions in the Jamia book.
Is that your forthcoming book, Margaret? Yeah. I did want to return to the question of history of emotions, but also the figure who's at the center of your book, which is Gerda, who's a woman. And so there's something about this writing of histories of institutions and spaces which have been rendered through very masculine tropes, masculine figures. History of Jamia, for example, we have read in our schools, is very much about men's history of historical changes. So I wanted to return to that question, and I wanted to think about the role of how to think of the role of this woman, obscure women, in shaping the educational history of India. And since we are a forum on democracy, I thought it would be great for you to comment on what was Gerda's role in popularizing Paim Talim and personalizing. What I thought was very interesting in her role was also how she personalized education through her very affectionate conversations with young girls. Her focus on practical training, for example, and especially the focus on learning from everyday objects. How do you think that broadened the scope of women's education and prepared them for more active participation in politics? And more broadly, how did Jamia fulfill this vision, or whether it did not fulfill that vision? Your quick comments on that.
Nishat Zedi and I just published a special issue in the Journal of Urdu Studies on Jamia's women. So for those in the audience who have an interest in the topic, you can look it up there. Just in a nutshell, I would try to resist a narrative where the white woman comes and liberates the brown women and Jamia and sets off a completely new story of liberation. Gerda certainly did not have the power or the social clout to do that at Jamia. What she did was to work together with what was already happening on the ground. So the wife of Abid Hussein, Zalia Abid Hussein, was already very active by the time that she arrived. The wife of Muhammad Mujib was an outstanding writer of novels and short stories. Begum Hussein was great in pulling strings behind the parda. The wife of Dr. Ansari was very, very engaged in a number of activities. First the mother and then the wife of Muhammad Ali Jauhar were closely linked to Jamia. So there was a whole network of women who were already there. And it is this coming together of Gerda and these women who had already started organizing themselves and who then, through the discussions that she initiated, had some kind of an extra push and then brought that forward. So I think it's a very different narrative from the kind of white savior woman who comes and liberates the poor Muslim women. The problem is that Jamia, at least until independence, was an extremely poor institution, so completely unlike Aligarh. So Aligarh could afford to invest in women's education. Jamia simply did not have the funds to do that. So until independence, there was a possibility for some of the girls to join classes, but given the fact that it was quite a conservative social milieu among Muslims, there were not many girls who took advantage of this possibility. Also, given the fact that Jamia had always to be very careful, as they were relying on donations, and donations mostly from Muslims. They had to be careful not to offend any of the Muslim groups, because otherwise part of the donations would dry up. So even if they themselves would have liked to push for girls' education, to have co-education at Jamia was a red flag for many of their potential donors, and that is one of the main reasons it didn't happen. So whatever happened behind the curtain and among the women, rather than the women coming out into the open.
Yeah, I was also thinking about universities in at the time, East Pakistan or now Bangladesh, and how Jamia was sort of very much a part of the conversation there too. With that, if Janaki and David, do you have any final comments?
No.
Kind of close to time. Okay, yeah. So thank you again for your patience, and I know, Janaki, you're short on time. Thank you, all the panelists, for this excellent discussion. And thank you, everyone, for being here, for being such an active audience. Janaki and David, thank you for engaging with us. And thank you, Margrit, for your persistence in pursuing this panel and sharing with us your work. And congratulations again on the book. To our viewers, if you have enjoyed our discussion, I encourage you to pick up a copy of Margrit's book, Jamia's Aapa. And of course, follow us on the Review of Democracy for more such discussions on democracy, politics, and history. Thank you again for joining us today, and to all the panelists for their time.